However, as far as I can tell, it has received almost no coverage from Western media. NPR first reported it, then Newsweek cited a Ukrainian government release, and then the International Atomic Energy Agency expressed concern, which should give you a sense of the gravity of the situ. But no one seems to be covering the deeper strategic implications, namely that Russia likely has a manpower problem. It all revolves around the Kakhovka Dam and reservoir, and if you lend me a moment of your time, I will try to convince you that this is extremely important for what will happen next. If you have heard of this dam before, it is likely because it was a focal point of Ukraine's Heron counter-offensive. It is one of the three crossings of the Dnipro near Ha City. Back during the summer of 2022, Ukraine kept a steady dose of HIMARS rockets targeting these bridges so as to restrict Russian troop movements. This created a manpower deficit up north, allowing Ukraine to push further away from Kharkiv in September, and eventually by November it forced Russia to withdraw from Ha City without a. That takes us to today's important events still back at the dam. Also beginning in November 2022 and continuing at least through February 2023, Russia opened some SLS and released water from the dam over that period. The water level in the reservoir behind it dropped from 16 meters to 13.83 meters. We know Russia is responsible for the drop because the roadway that runs along the top of the dam is destroyed. Russia did this during its November retreat, but simultaneously was careful not to damage the dam itself. As a result, the front lines have a clear division with Ukraine west of the dam and Russia east of it. The dams, SLS, are open on the Russian side, but not on the Ukrainian side, meaning that this order came from Moscow on the surface level. And yes, I just made a water pun. The reason why Russia might want to do this is straightforward. Releasing water from the dam lowers the reservoir, but raises the water level on the other side, expanding the river. In the process, when Russia began raising water, Ukraine had the initiative along the southern, rising waters limit Ukraine's ability to exploit that the higher the water is, the harder it is for troops to cross, whether because boats take more time and therefore draw more enemy fire, or because the pontoon bridges need to be longer. You might recall that Ukraine adopted the same strategy at the beginning of the war, releasing the urban river dam to have the key reservoir flood potential invasion paths to the capital. The difference back down south is that the active battle in Heron has died down to the point where Zelensky has taken a trip there, with the front lines becoming more or less stagnant. In other words, flooding the river plain is a proactive strategy for Russia. Why do that? Well, if the Dnipro River is harder to cross, Russia can afford to redeploy troops from the Heron theater into the northern theaters. Conceivably, the benefit here is to aid the much-heralded Russian winter offensive, and if this is where the story ended, it would be bad news for Ukraine. The rising waters would just represent an environmental catastrophe within its borders to support a Russian attack. However, there may be a silver lining for Ukraine here. If you look at who bears the cost of the flooding, right now, it's mostly in Russian-held territory. By itself, that would not be much consolation to Ukraine, given that Kiev has eyes to take back that land. But let's look at the damage for a second. It includes the direct flooding that has captured our attention thus far, but also lost irrigation to the southeast and a nuclear dilemma that has the IAEA's attention to the northeast as a starting point. Let's zoom out from the near Heron City. Under normal times, the green space is to the south of the river. That is because correspondingly, the floodplain is mostly to the south. Thus, when the dam's SLS go up, water levels do indeed rise on both banks of the river, as illustrated earlier. However, Ukrainian-held territory will only see a fraction of that. Instead, given the status quo, Russia is going to bear the majority of the land use problems that come with the flooding. And as citizens near the urban river know, the water might take years to fully recede. Heading back to the dam, the second problem Russia faces is with the irrigation that was central to its original construction. This line here coming out of the reservoir is the North Crimean Canal, completed at the end of 1975. The canal draws water from the Dnipro River and transports it all the way to the peninsula. It is also one of the substantive causes of the war. Back in 2014, Ukraine dammed the canal to cut off Crimea's water supply, drying out the many crop fields that fueled the peninsula's economy. This was the best sanction that Ukraine could muster to respond to Russia's annexation of the T. Given the rest of the chaos that was going on in the country at the time, back to today in the opening thrust of the current war, Russia destroyed the canal dam, allowing water to flow back to Crimea. But for the canal to draw any water whatsoever, you need to have a high water level back at the Kakhovka Dam to fill it in here. And since Russia opened the Kakhovka Dam, the canal has been drying. To make matters worse, the canal also irrigates crops through aqueducts that extend outward before the canal even reaches the peninsula. Consequently, crops will fail in the area in between as well. This is why Ukraine did not simply shut off the canal at the source 9 years ago. It wanted to harm Russia's agricultural output, not its own. The third problem is much further up the river, potentially more dangerous dangerous by significant margin. And something that we have covered before, it is the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. These are nuclear fuel rods. The key component to electricity production spent nuclear fuel. Rods must spend years in cooling pools to release all of their decay, heat, and prevent them from seeping ready. Cool water goes in, absorbs the heat, warm water goes out, and the cycle continues for a decade or more. This is why you find nuclear reactors next to bodies of water. They need a source for their cooling pools, but as you have likely guessed, in addition to all of the other problems with the power plant opening, the dam SLS has lowered the water level all the way upstream in ZAP. Regarding the IAEA's warning, the water levels are not a problem yet. The power plant keeps its supply pond higher than the river, giving the cooling pool some wiggle room. But if levels drop by just another 2/3 of a meter, then the power plant will need to implement some sort of emergency solution. And a further meter pass that could cause irreversible ecological damage regardless of what is going on at a nuclear power plant. Pulling these 3 points together, it might just sound like Russia is destroying Ukrainian infrastructure and land to raise the chances that Moscow's counterattack succeeds. Bad for Kiev, good for Moscow, more so it seems. But it is not that simple. Remember, the area that Ukraine controls is only marginally affected. This also perhaps hints at why the draining has not received much news attention. This is the only place Western journalists have easy access to the areas directly south of Harris City, the nuclear power plant, the farms along the canal, and of course Crimea itself are all controlled by Russia. And by the Russian law assigned here, those Russian-held parts are actually part of Russia just as much as Moscow or St. Petersburg. As far as anyone can tell, Moscow's long-term plan is to possess and profit from these areas. From this perspective, draining the river is self-sabotage, which leaves us to wonder why. These are obvious problems for any military planner, so it is unlikely that Russia is simply blundering again. Instead, the logical explanation is that Russia is still facing a manpower shortage. The argument here is simple. If the Kremlin believed that troops were plentiful for the winter campaign up north, Russia would not be paying a high cost to divert resources from Heron. That is to say, despite the outward appearances. Otherwise, this is good news for Kiev, but before anyone there begins to celebrate, this comes with some caveats. First, recall how the reservoir draining began back in November 2022. It just took a while for the consequences to become obvious. What we might be seeing now is the after effects of a Russian stopgap measure from long. In other words, Russia had manpower issues, but that was at the end of 2022. Today is a different story. It may be the case that Putin's mobilization from this September announcement eventually solved the problem. Russia just needed to construct a metaphorical bridge to get there. If that is correct, then what we are seeing at Kakhovka was good news for Ukraine at a time when no one publicly realized it. Now it is effectively meaningless. There is also the possibility that manpower issues or not, Russia has a strategy in the Donbass that justifies the sacrifice down south. Getting to that magical 3-2-1 troop advantage may just be taking a little more for Russia than it ordinarily should. If so, dead crops in Russian-controlled territory are little consolation to Ukraine if it means further loss of territory elsewhere. However, the optimistic interpretation for Kiev is that the Russian offensive is just not what has been advertised, and that Russia is ostensibly paying the bulk of the cost because the Kremlin does not anticipate holding onto the territory for much longer anyway. We have discussed before that the entire winter narrative has been a puzzle. Whether this is a stalemate, a basic winter slowdown, Ukraine is quietly baiting Russia, or that we are witnessing the beginnings of a true Russia and offensive. But every day that goes by where Russia is not making major gains or even deploying at a level of troops that could plausibly make those gains happen suggests that Russia's winter offensive was simply dead on arrival. To be clear, no one should be drawing that conclusion quite yet, but it is something that will hover over the front lines for the weeks to come. After all, a few months from now, it is plausible that we will be talking about how this was Russia's clever redeployment strategy that led to a break. If you want to know more about the invasion, you will love my book that examines the causes of it. Check below for more information on that. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care. I use this photo a bunch. It is one of my favorite photos of Zelensky because it was taken right before he ditched the suit for his informal war attire. But I recently realized it also perfectly encapsulates Boris Johnson's personality. That tie is all over the place,